Welcome to the Crunch McDabbles Show. I'm your host, Crunch McDabbles, the blue-collar scholar himself. Today's show, we continue looking at debuffing monsters with the Frighten condition. The Frighten condition. Clearly, this should have been in last week's video on debuffing monster AC, but it wasn't. Thankfully, people took the time to comment, which I'm really thankful for. The comments are always great. The discussions are interesting, and I always learn something there or get interested about something there. And when I took a closer look at the Frighten condition, I realized just how great this was. So good that the Frighten condition really deserves a close-up look. Why is Frighten great? Well, for one thing, it affects everything, almost everything. You take a status penalty equal to your Frighten value to all checks and DCs. So, what are checks and DCs? Well, almost everything that has to do with the D20 in the game is a check or a DC. Almost every roll of the D20 is a check, and almost every roll of the D20 is made against a DC. So this means that you get a minus penalty to attacks, to saving throws, to armor class. See, armor class is a kind of DC. It's called a special DC, but it's a DC nonetheless. That kind of tripped me up. But also perception checks, perception DCs, skill checks, almost everything. And when you touch a D20, you're going to be making a check or a DC. So few things aren't DCs or checks. That would be initiative, flat checks, or dying checks. Those are a few that I could think of. Well, I guess dying check is a kind of flat check. Other than that, almost every time you touch a D20 in this game, which is frequently, really, the game's a D20 based game, the Frighten condition is going to affect it. So the Frighten condition, it's the everything penalty. The Frighten condition is also good because there's one low cost, low action way to give the condition, that being a Demoralize attempt with the intimidation skill. This single action isn't even a trained skill. You attempt an intimidation check against the target's will DC, and if successful, the target's Frightened 1. If you critically succeed, the target is Frightened 2. This didn't require a spell slot. It isn't an attack, so there's no multiple attack penalty. It didn't even require two actions, just a single action on your turn, and you can attempt to demoralize. And given how much this Frightened condition affects the target, that being all aspects of the D20 game, it's definitely worth a try. Another great thing about the Frightened condition is that it seems to be always caused by targeting a creature's will save, as we saw with Demoralize there. Whether will save is actually a good save to target, I suppose that kind of depends on your philosophy, or obviously there are monsters with great will saves. But if I was going into a fight and I didn't know what I was going against, and I had to choose ahead of time which of the three saves I had to go against, I would choose the will save every time. Whether that's wise or not, I don't know, but for whatever it's worth, the Frightened condition is guarded by a will save. I kind of like that. But sometimes there isn't even a save at all. An Evoker Wizard's Dread Aura is a 30-foot burst that needs to be sustained, but creatures in the aura are Frightened 1, and they can't even reduce the Frightened while they're in the burst. So this is a focus spell you could get at level 8 as an Enchanter Wizard, but what a great use of a focus point, because each combat you could put it out there. Sure, you need to spend an action each round sustaining it, but look how devastating that effect is. And if you're a caster that uses a lot of DC saves with your spells, this is a great way to soften your enemies and land those nasty DC spells. The Bard's cantrip Dirge of Doom is similar. It's a single action focus cantrip you could get at level 6 that has to be repeated every round. So you have to spend an action every round. So that's kind of like the Dread Aura we just looked at. You have to give up an action each round to keep it out there. Although this is a little better because it's not sustained. So you could drop this for a round if you had to move out of harm's way or something, and then reestablish it with a single action because it's a cantrip. But creatures in the 30-foot burst are Frightened 1, and just like with Dread Aura, they can't reduce their Frightened values below 1. Some classes have feats that let you give the Frightened condition with no save too. The fighter can use an Intimidating Strike, a second level feat, at the cost of an extra action. If they hit with their attack, they make the creature Frightened 1 or Frightened 2 on a critical hit. So there's no save there though, which is good for a fighter if they've dumped their charisma or if they didn't want to put a skill rank in Intimidate, this is a great way for a fighter to help out with the debuffing. And there are a couple of feats that have Frightened on a critical hit, and these also don't have a saving throw. Rogues had the Brutal Beating feat at level 2, and whenever they critically hit, they add the Frighten 1 condition. For one, this is a great name for a feat. I like that one, Brutal Beating. And B, I like feats like this because it's always on. Every time you crit, you make something frightened, so you don't have to think about it. It just happens. If you add this to the level 4 rogue feat Dread Striker, where frightened creatures are flat-footed to you, one, this is another great named feat. I like Dread Striker. And B, this is another great way to get flat-footed targets out there for your rogue abilities to go off. A Marshal's Dread Aura is even better. While in this aura, critical hits give the Frighten 1 condition. It's like the Marshal is giving everyone in their aura the Brutal Beating feat, and there are benefits on top of that. You could also throw a Fearsome Rune on your weapon or a Greater Fearsome Rune at level 12. When you critically hit now, you give the Frighten condition with no save, so that is a great weapon for some kind of Dread Knight. I like that. Obviously, don't do this if you have the level 2 Rogue Feat Brutal Beating, or if you have a Marshal in the party who's always putting up a Dread Marshal stance aura, but otherwise it's not a bad rune, pretty good rune. So Frightened is an easy, low-cost way to debuff almost everything a monster does involving a d20, which is most of the game. So that's the great part about Frightened. There are a couple tricky parts. One tricky part is it's pretty easy to get rid of the Frightened condition. Your Frightened value decreases by 1 at the end of every turn, which means that Demoralize attempt you just landed on an enemy giving them Frightened 1, it's going to be gone at the end of their turn. There are some ways around this. There are a bunch of abilities that allow you to keep a creature's Frightened value from going below 1, like we saw with the Enchanter Wizard's Dread Aura or the Bard's Dirge of Doom. This means that you can keep that -1 status penalty out there longer. A monk in Dragon Stance can make a dragon roar, and if a creature frightened by the dragon roar starts its turn adjacent to the monk, they can't reduce their frightened value below 1, which is actually pretty nasty because they can't even move away because the monk can just move back up to adjacent with them on their turn. So good luck getting rid of that frightened condition. A Swashbuckler with the level 2 feat Antagonize, if they make a target frightened with a Demoralize, that target can't go below Frightened 1 unless that target takes a hostile action against you. This is like the classic taunt or intimidation ability where you force monsters to attack you. So well done, Pathfinder, for putting this in the game, and it's actually really well done. It's too bad it's on the Swashbuckler class, but it's only a level 2 feat, so if you're making an Intimitank, splash in a little swashy with it, and by level 6 you could be antagonizing monsters all over the place. Evil champions have the Aura of Despair feat at level 4, where they have a 15-foot emanation, and creatures in that aura can't reduce their frightened condition to lower than 1. Although this ability doesn't produce a fear effect on its own, it does also decrease saves versus fear, so there's some good and bad there. It's too bad it's only on evil champions because this is really an awesome ability. I love this one, and it just feels right on like a Dread Knight of some kind. And finally, a Hobgoblin Ancestry. At first level, they can take the Ancestry feat Remorseless Lash. When you succeed at a melee strike against a frightened foe, that creature can't reduce its frightened condition below 1 until the beginning of your next turn. So as long as your Hobgoblin keeps hitting that creature at Demoralized, it will stay frightened. It's worth pointing out with that one, that would include attacks of opportunity that the creature incurred on its turn too. So if you miss with your regular attacks, but then on its turn you hit with an attack of opportunity, it wouldn't be able to lose the frightened condition because it reduces the frightened condition at the end of its turn. So your attack of opportunity would happen before that. The other problem with the frightened condition, at least from the perspective of giving it by means of the Demoralize action, is that once you use Demoralize on a monster, save or fail, the target's immune for 10 minutes. So you can use Demoralize over and over to target different monsters, but you can't use it over and over to target the same monster. There are some ways around this. First, obviously just use another ability besides Demoralize. There are a bunch of spells that make things frightened. A fear spell is on every spell list. Arcane, Occult, Divine, Primal. It's a first level spell, so if you already use your Demoralize, nail them with the fear spell. There are bunches of spells that give the frightened condition. Many of them inflict mental damage along with the frightened condition, and all of them are will saves for whatever that's worth, whether that's good or bad. Depends on your philosophy. Yeah. But there are also consumables too if you aren't magically inclined. A dread ampule. A, it has an awesome name, and B, it inflicts mental damage and the frightened condition and splash damage, and it has built-in item bonus, and it doesn't cost too much. Throw a couple of these in a bandolier and chuck them out when the time is right. It's a great consumable. Or there is terrifying ammunition if your preferred method of delivering death and destruction on the battlefield is from afar. It's a level 6 item. It's 50 gold pieces per shot. If it hits, it does damage and forces a DC 20 will save, which may be good for whatever that's worth. It's a will save, depends on your philosophy, yada. Even on a successful save, it's frightened 1, and on a failure, it has to spend an action calming itself down, or it can't go below frightened 1. So that's great. That's pretty good. There is another way to get around the immune to your Demoralize attempt too. Here's an interesting one. Become a master at the occultism skill and take the skill feat Disturbing Knowledge. Another great name. These are just great names. It's 2 actions, not one action like the Demoralize. So that is bad. But you can use it on a creature you previously demoralized. Just use this one instead. Like a Demoralize, there's no cost, no spell slot, no focus point, no multiple attack penalty, just 2 actions, and you make an occultism check against their will DC. Again, will DC, maybe that's good. It depends on your philosophy. But for whatever that's worth, you make them frightened or worse, and then they're immune for 24 hours. But use it when a creature is immune to your Demoralize for a free second chance to frighten a monster. Not bad. And one other way to get around the immune to Demoralize, it involves swashbucklers again. These guys, they're the tyrant kings of intimidation, really, with the antagonize and now this. A swashbuckler with the braggart style. For one, they gain panache when they intimidate a monster, which is great for them. And if you already used a Demoralize on a monster, once you're level 9 with the braggart exemplary finisher, if you hit that monster with the finisher, you can remove their temporary immunity to Demoralize. Then hit them with the Demoralize again, gain panache from it, and restart the cycle. Obviously, this gets messed up if you miss on the Demoralize attempt. Then you have to get panache some other way, but you'll find a way to work around that. Tumble through them or something. All of this makes your items that increase your intimidation important. The level 11 item, the Gorget of the Primal Roar. See, there's only one Primal Roar, and it's this one. It's the Primal Roar. It gives you +1 to your intimidation checks, and if you're in a polymorphed animal form like a druid, once during each polymorph duration, you can make an intimidation check against every target within 30 feet. Yeah. And if you have a loose 15,000 gold hanging around just in your folding money, a Dread Blindfold is pretty great. For one, it has a great name. Come on. And B, it gives +3 to intimidation checks. And the first time someone sees you in a day, they have to make a DC 37 will save or be frightened 1. That's awesome. Your party, after about a week, they start to get used to your horrible, horrific, creepy blindfold you're wearing, and they become immune to this effect. But up until then, you just wake up in the morning, everybody's like, oh, cripes. So that much is good. But this thing makes you very intimidating, +3 on your intimidation check, so that's good. And you put dread, if you put dread in a name, I just love it. Just dread anything. I think it's awesome. And that is it. I've been your host, Crunch McDoubles. This has been the Crunch McDoubles Show. Golarion is a dangerous place, but have no fear. Instead, make your enemies fear. Give them the frightened condition with a sweet Demoralize attempt.